Hi, I'm Jillian, and you are listening to The Mindset of Podcasting, where we not only talk about the technical side of launching and managing your podcast, but also about building your confidence in yourself and the power of your voice. Your business and your podcast depends so much on your mindset. So I will be diving deep into the mindset blocks and issues that we go through when starting and running your own podcast so you can feel confident in your message and in your voice. It's time to listen in and feel confident about yourself and your podcast. Hello and welcome back to the Mindset of Podcasting. I'm so glad you're here today because we are going to talk all about managing your podcast guest. So if you have guests on your podcast, then this episode is for you. I do have guests on my podcast if you've been listening. And so I'm going to walk you through my process of how I get guests, how I keep my guests organized, and then a few tips for during the guest interview. So finding guests for your show. Well, obviously, start with your friends, start with your clients, start with people you know, reach out to them. If they're a good fit for your podcast, make sure that they're a good fit and that your listeners will benefit from them. But yeah, reach out to people that you already know. That's going to be the easiest first way to start. So when reaching out to people that you don't know, you're going to want to tell them who your listeners are, why your listeners would enjoy hearing what they have to say, and what topics you would like them to discuss on the podcast. Make sure you're making them feel important and that they will give so much value to your listeners. But give them things that they can talk about, give them reasons that they should be on your podcast. Don't just make it all about you and how great your podcast is, even though I'm sure it is. Make it about them and say why you want them to come on your show. So I would just send them an email and say, hey, I would love to have you on a guest on my podcast. This is who listens. This is why I think that they would benefit from what you have to say. And here are some topics I would love for you to discuss. If you're interested, please let me know and I can send you a link to schedule an interview. A good tip is to pitch to someone when they are launching something like a book or a course or a program or whatever it is they're launching. They will be more willing to be on podcasts because they're in promotion mode. They're ready to promote everything that they have. So that's my little tip. Try to pitch somebody when they're in the middle of a launch. You can also create a one sheet for your podcast. So a one sheet is going to be one sheet, one sheet of paper, which tells about you, your podcast, and your stats. Sometimes people will request this when you are pitching to them. So you can send it in your email to them. I will have examples of this in the show notes. I will show you mine and then a few others that there are too. But a one sheet is a great little thing to give out to people. Even if you're just starting, like if you're just starting your podcast, you can put that on there. We're just starting, but this is me. This is the podcast. This is who listens, just something to give them so they know more about your podcast and you don't have to write it out in every email. You can just attach it. So go to the show notes if you want to see examples of them. So some good sites if you want to find guests. If you've talked to everybody that you know, you've already interviewed them, and now you're at the end of your list and you're like, where do I find guests? Matchmaker.fm is great for finding guests. I have found guests for my podcast on Matchmaker.fm. I have a few more coffee chats with people on there that I have met to see if they're good fits to be guests on my podcast. You can also reach out to other podcasts to be guests on them, which I'll talk about a little bit later in this episode. But Matchmaker.fm, I would set up a profile there. It's free to set up a profile. You get so many conversations, like messages between people on the free plan. I'm not exactly sure how much it is if you're not on the free plan, but I'm on the free plan and it's working great. Another group that I love is the Podcast Collective Facebook group. That group is great. There is a lot of posting in there, people looking for guests. You can go in there and find tons of posts. So request to join that group. I have the link for both of those in the show notes, but those are the two of the best places that I found if you're looking for guests. So after somebody says, yes, I'll be a guest on your podcast, what happens? What are you going to send them? How are we going to do this? So first, I would set up Calendly. It is a free scheduling app. This is so much easier than going back and forth saying, hey, are you available Monday at 2? No, I'm not. How about Tuesday at 1? And going back and forth in emails. That's just really annoying. So go to Calendly, set up your schedule so that you can pick the times that work best for you. And then you can just send your guest a link. Just say, here, book a call at this link. And super easy. I hate going back and forth between people, so a link is the best thing to do. Make sure that in Calendly, you're setting up some automatic reminder emails. You can do this through there where you just remind them, hey, in 1 day, we have our call. In 1 hour, we have our call, just so that keeps them reminded that, hey, we have a call and you don't get stood up. Another thing is to send your guests some tips for recording. Maybe these guests have never been on a podcast before and they don't know what they need to do. So make sure you're telling them, they need to be in a quiet space. They need to have a microphone and headphones, definitely headphones for a guest interview. You don't want to get that feedback. Just give them a few tips so that they know, hey, make sure that there's no background noise and that we can hear you clearly. Another thing I would send your guest is a form. You can create this in Google Form, Typeform, whatever form app you want to use, but create a form where you get their name, their email, ask them for their bio, ask them to submit a headshot. These will be good for a social media post. Ask them for any links that they want you to link to in the show notes if they're offering a freebie or they just want you to link to their Instagram. Ask all this in the form so you have everything in one place and you don't have to go back and forth getting everything. So let's talk about some tips for when you're interviewing them. So I would do a little bit of research prior to the guest being interviewed. That way you have some backup questions ready. You know a little bit more about them. You don't feel like you're going in not knowing them at all. I really like to have coffee chats with my guests that I don't know beforehand, just so we can get to know each other. I find that that's easier. But if you don't have time to do that, I would spend the first few minutes getting to know them before you hit record, making sure you can pronounce their name correctly. I'm very big on pronouncing names correctly, and I usually ask all my guests to make sure I pronounce their name, how it should be pronounced. And then you can also take the time to let them know how the interview is going to go, let them know it can be edited out so they can start over if they want to. I always let my guests know this. I'll be like, hey, I'm going to hit record. We're going to start. If you want to start over, if you don't like what you said, just let me know and we can keep going and we'll just edit that out. And then I always let them know when we end the podcast, I'm going to hit end record, but we'll stay on a little bit after just so we can talk in case there was anything that you wanted to change. The best tip I have for guest interviews is to be an active listener. Try not to interrupt. I know it's kind of natural when somebody else is talking that you want them to know that you're understanding, that you're going, oh yeah, exactly. But that can kind of be distracting. So I would try not to interrupt, just let them talk. And then once they stop, you can say what you want to say. You don't have to keep doing the to let them know that you're listening. Just show them that you're being an active listener by making eye contact and watching them. So after the interview, it's good to send a thank you. Let them know that you appreciate them being on your show. Let them know when it will go live. Send them any promotional graphics that you have made and the link to your podcast. That's always good to do. I usually send this the Friday before the podcast episode goes out. That way they can plan their next week of post if they need to do that. So make sure you're telling them thank you and sending them everything they need to help you promote the podcast. Also, when I send the promotions to them, I ask them to review the podcast. This will help with my ratings and being searchable. So I give them the link and ask them, hey, I would be so thankful if you could submit a review for the podcast. And then when you're promoting your podcast, make sure you tag them on the day it goes live. Tag them in the post, tag them in stories, tag them in anything that you can, just so that they can share it with their audience. So having guests on your podcast, I think, is really important. It gives other viewpoints. It helps you network and meet new people. And for me, it has helped me get out of my comfort zone a little bit because, reaching out to people can be scary, especially if you don't know them. But it's helped me get out of my comfort zone a little bit. And I've met amazing people by just reaching out to them saying, hey, will you be a guest on my show? And we have started to form a friendship, collabing. It's amazing. So get out of your comfort zone a little bit. Reach out to those people that you want guests. The worst they can do is say no or ignore you. I've also had emails that never get answered. So, that's the worst that can happen. They either say no or they don't answer. And you know what? You move on to the next person you would like to have on. So don't be afraid. Reach out to people. Have them as your guest. And if you have any questions, you can always reach out to me. I'm at Jillian Grover Podcasting on Instagram, or you can email me at jillian@jilliangrover.com. So now my little ending segment I always kind of do just to give you a little update on everything. So my podcast tip of the week. Since we're talking about guest management, let's talk about the importance of being a guest on other podcasts. I told you I'd come back to this. So when you're a guest on other podcasts, their listeners are already on the platform. They're already listening to podcasts. So it's so easy for them to hop over to your podcast when you're talking. If you're like, hey, check out my podcast, they're already on the app listening. So they can just quickly search yours and download some of your episodes. It also helps show that you are an expert in your field. Most people have somebody on their podcast when they're an expert in a certain field so that they can ask questions and get more insights. This will help you be seen as the expert. And again, it helps you meet new people and maybe have them as guests on your show. So you can go to the same things, the matchmaker.fm or the podcast collective group, and look for shows that are looking for guests and be a guest on their show. So what is happening in my business? Well, I am planning for season 2 of my podcast, and I am actually looking for guests. So people that I am looking for. If you have been thinking of starting a podcast, but something is holding you back, I would love to help coach you on those fears. Don't worry, there's no commitment to actually start a podcast if we do that. It's just for the episode. If you have a fear of using your voice, whether it's for lives, audios, or on stories, I would love to talk about that fear. If you do mindset work with your clients, like getting over limiting beliefs, imposter syndrome, or any other mindset work, I'd love to have you as a guest. If you are a service provider, you do social media, websites, systems, marketing, anything, I'd love to talk to you about how we can use that for podcasting. So if you'd like to be a guest on the Mindset of Podcasting, please go to the show notes and fill out the form, and I will be in touch with you. So what is happening in my life right now? Well, my daughter just had a baby girl, Calliope Jane. She will be almost a month old when this episode comes out. So I'm very excited. We're going out July 4th weekend to go see her. They live about 5 hours away. So we're not super close, which is a little sad, but we are going to go out to see her and my grandson. My grandson will be turning 2 in August. So we're going to go see all of them in July, and I'm really looking forward to it. So thank you so much for listening to this episode. And again, reach out if you have any questions, and I will talk to you next week. Thank you so much for listening. Are you ready to launch your podcast and get your message out to the world, but the thought of all the tech and equipment and the fear of the unknown is holding you back? Stop worrying, because I can help guide you through it all. Launching a podcast is an exciting time, but it can quickly become overwhelming trying to figure out everything you have to do to get your show out to the world. I have different launch packages to meet all of your needs. You can check them out at jilliangrover.com/launch. Let's work together to make a fantastic podcast show that your audience will want to listen to every week. We will work closely together for 6 weeks to prepare for your launch. Accelerated packages are available. I will be your guide as I help you select and set up everything you need to get your podcast out to the world. Go to jilliangrover.com/launch to learn more or to book your discovery call with me. That's JILLIAN Grover.com/launch.